Relationships, they hold our dreams, our fears, and sometimes, our deepest secrets. Welcome to Wild Love Story, where we bring you the raw, unfiltered tales of love, heartbreak, and redemption. Love is beautiful, but it's also complicated. Each story we share reveals not only the strength of the human heart but also the fragility of trust. Today, we're bringing you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about relationships. A tale of betrayal, confrontation, and the courage to face the truth. This is more than a story, it's a window into the lives of people navigating the highs and lows of love. We give you the moments they cherish, the mistakes they regret, and the lessons they've learned. In today's episode, one husband stumbles upon a moment that will change his life forever. What he hears, what he discovers, and how he reacts will stay with you long after the story ends. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every day, we bring you stories that uncover the hidden truths of love, truths that can shatter or strengthen us. This is Wild Love Story. Let's begin. My name is Dan. I met my wife, Sarah, during my sophomore year of college. She was the kind of person who could light up a room without even trying. Her laugh had this infectious quality, it made you feel like everything was going to be okay. From the moment we met, it felt like we were meant to be. We became inseparable. Sarah had a way of making even the smallest moments feel significant. Whether we were studying late at the library or grabbing midnight snacks, every minute with her felt like an adventure. I was convinced I'd found the person I was going to spend the rest of my life with. We graduated, got jobs, and started building a life together. Marriage was the next step, it felt natural, almost inevitable. Our wedding was small but beautiful, surrounded by family and friends. I remember looking at her that day, thinking, this is it. This is forever. The first few years of marriage were everything I hoped for. We had our little routines, Saturday morning coffee runs, binge-watching our favorite shows, and dreaming about the future. We talked about kids, travel plans, and the life we'd create together. Sarah was ambitious, and I admired that about her. She threw herself into her career, working long hours but always finding time for us. I was proud of her, and I wanted to support her in every way I could. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment when things started to change. Maybe it was the stress of work, or maybe we got too comfortable in our routines. Whatever it was, I didn't see it coming. At the time, everything still felt normal. People often say you can tell when someone is pulling away, but I didn't feel that. I was happy, or at least I thought I was. Sarah and I still laughed, shared stories, and made plans. There was no sign, no warning. Just life moving forward as it always had. I don't know if I was oblivious or if Sarah was just good at hiding things. Either way, I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. She was my wife, my partner, and my best friend. And I trusted her completely. If you had told me back then what I would uncover, I wouldn't have believed you. But life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. It started small, almost unnoticeable. Sarah began working later than usual. At first, it made sense, her office had picked up a big project, and she was always the type to go above and beyond. I'd tease her about being a perfectionist, and she'd laugh, saying, "It's just for a few weeks, I promise." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Then came the calls. Short, hushed conversations that ended the moment I entered the room. She'd smile and tell me it was just work-related, some last-minute updates her team needed. I didn't think twice. I trusted her completely, and it didn't feel like there was any reason not to. But those late nights became more frequent. Weekends, too. Sometimes, she'd leave the house unexpectedly, saying she forgot something at the office or had a quick meeting to attend. I'd offer to drive her or wait up for her to come home, but she always insisted it wasn't necessary. I remember one night vividly. I had cooked dinner, her favorite pasta dish, and set the table with candles, thinking it might be nice to have a quiet evening together. I even texted her to let her know, and she responded with a quick, "Sounds amazing. Be home soon." She didn't come home soon. Hours passed. The candles burned down to stubs, and the pasta went cold. I texted her again, asking if everything was okay, and she replied, "Sorry. Got caught up at work. Don't wait up." It stung, but I brushed it off. Work could be unpredictable, I told myself. She was ambitious, and I admired that about her. Still, things started to feel different. She wasn't just distant physically, she was emotionally absent, too. Conversations felt shorter, more surface level. The laughter we once shared so easily seemed harder to come by. She stopped asking about my day or sharing details about hers. I tried to fill the silence by being supportive, thinking that maybe she was just stressed. I'd ask if she needed help or a break, but she'd wave it off, telling me everything was fine. And I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. There was one moment, though, that I couldn't shake. She had left her phone on the counter while she went to grab something upstairs. A message popped up on the screen, a name I didn't recognize. The preview read, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." I froze. My mind raced, but I couldn't bring myself to open the message. It felt like crossing a line, one I wasn't ready to step over. Instead, I put the phone down and walked away, convincing myself it was nothing. A colleague, a joke, something innocent. But the doubts had been planted, and they grew quickly. I started noticing little things I had previously overlooked. The way she'd tilt her phone screen away when I walked into the room. The sudden urgency with which she'd end calls, saying, "I'll call you back," without explaining who she was talking to. Once, while doing laundry, I found a receipt in her jacket pocket, an expensive dinner for two at a restaurant we'd never been to together. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding. When I finally asked her about it, she laughed, saying it was from a client meeting. "You know how work is," she said casually, and I nodded, pretending I did. The worst part was the guilt. Not hers, mine. I felt guilty for doubting her, for even letting these thoughts cross my mind. This was Sarah, my wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for years. How could I question her? But the signs kept piling up. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and realized Sarah wasn't in bed. I got up to look for her and found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with her laptop open. When I asked what she was doing, she jumped, startled, and quickly closed the screen. "Just work," she said, smiling a little too quickly. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What kind of work needed to be done in the middle of the night, with the laptop screen tilted away from view? The cracks in our relationship, the ones I had ignored or patched over, were becoming impossible to miss. I started questioning everything, her late nights, her vague explanations, the way she seemed to avoid my gaze when we talked. But even then, I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was overthinking, letting my imagination run wild. I tried to push the doubts away, to hold on to the life we had built together. What I didn't realize was that the truth was much closer than I thought. And it was only a matter of time before I'd be forced to face it. It was a Wednesday evening. I remember that because I had planned to stay late at work for a team meeting. But the meeting was cancelled last minute, so I decided to head home early. I thought it might be a nice surprise for Sarah. We hadn't had much time together recently, and I figured we could spend the evening catching up. The house was quiet when I arrived, which wasn't unusual. Sarah often worked in the bedroom or her home office with her headphones on. I set my bag down and called out, "Sarah. I'm home." No response. I walked into the kitchen, noticing her car keys on the counter. She was definitely home. I thought maybe she was resting, so I started toward the stairs. That's when I heard it, a voice. Hers. I paused mid-step, my heart suddenly racing. She was talking to someone, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded casual, almost light-hearted. I took another step, and that's when I heard it clearly. Aren't you afraid Dan will catch us? My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The words echoed in my head. I stood there, gripping the banister, trying to process what I'd just heard. Was this a joke? A misunderstanding? A work conversation taken out of context? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk out the door, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But another part, the part that couldn't ignore the doubts I'd been suppressing, compelled me to keep going. I took a deep breath and climbed the rest of the stairs as quietly as I could. My pulse was pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. When I reached the top, I could hear her voice more clearly now, but I still couldn't make out the other person. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill into the hallway. I stepped closer, each step feeling heavier than the last. My palms were sweaty, and my throat felt dry. Then I heard laughter. Hers again. I pushed the door open. There she was, sitting on the bed, her back to me. She had her phone pressed to her ear, laughing softly. She didn't notice me at first. I stood there, frozen, watching her as every possible explanation raced through my mind. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe. Then she turned her head and saw me. Her smile disappeared instantly, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it shock? Guilt? Fear? She quickly ended the call, saying, "I'll call you back," and set the phone down beside her. "Dan," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you're home early." I didn't respond right away. I was too focused on the phone. My eyes darted to it, then back to her. She noticed, of course, and quickly picked it up, clutching it tightly. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No one," she said too quickly. "Just a friend from work." "A friend," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. My mind flashed back to the message I'd seen days ago, the receipt in her jacket, the late nights, the distant behavior. It all started clicking into place, like puzzle pieces forming a picture I didn't want to see. "Dan, it's not what you think," she said, standing up now, her voice more urgent. "I don't even know what to think," I replied, stepping further into the room. "So why don't you tell me? Who was that? What's going on?" She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "It's nothing," she said finally. "Just work stuff. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Sarah, I heard what you said. Aren't you afraid Dan will catch us? What am I supposed to think?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down, avoiding my gaze. That silence, that heavy, suffocating silence, said more than any words could have. I felt my stomach drop. I stepped back, shaking my head. "Just tell me the truth," I said, my voice breaking. "Dan," she started, her voice soft now, almost pleading. "It's complicated." That word. Complicated. It felt like a slap in the face. "So it's true," I said, my voice barely audible. "There's someone else." She didn't deny it. In that moment, it felt like the ground beneath me had given way. Every memory, every promise, every moment we'd shared, it all felt tainted, like a cruel joke I hadn't been in on. "I'm sorry," she said finally, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen." But her words didn't matter. Nothing she could say would have mattered. All I could think about was how blind I had been, how much I had trusted her, and how easily she had broken that trust. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't. The weight of it all was too much. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there. As I walked down the stairs, I felt like I was in a daze. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of our relationship, every sign I had ignored. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I just knew I couldn't stay there. That night, as I sat alone in my car, staring at the darkened street ahead, I realized that my life would never be the same. I had uncovered the truth, but it felt like I had lost everything in the process. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car for hours, replaying every moment in my head. My mind kept circling back to the same questions: why? How long? Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? I couldn't find the answers, and the silence only made it worse. When I finally walked back into the house the next morning, the weight of the truth felt unbearable. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her face pale and her eyes red and puffy. I didn't need to ask if she had been crying, I could see it. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Neither of us spoke, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, I broke the silence. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and strained. She nodded, barely meeting my eyes. I sat down across from her, but the words I wanted to say didn't come right away. I kept thinking about how to start, how to ask the questions that had been tormenting me all night. Finally, I just said it. "Why, Sarah?" She flinched, as though the question itself was painful. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared down at her coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the mug. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know?" I repeated, my anger rising. "How can you not know? You made a choice, Sarah. You made several choices. How can you sit there and say you don't know?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "I didn't plan this. It just happened. It just happened." I said, my voice louder now. "You don't accidentally lie to your husband. You don't accidentally meet someone else. You don't accidentally betray the person you promised to love and be faithful to. So tell me, Sarah, how did this just happen?" She broke down then, tears streaming down her face as she tried to explain. She told me about how she had been feeling distant, how she felt like we had grown apart over the years. She said she had been lonely, that she felt like we were living parallel lives instead of sharing one. "You're gone so much," she said. "You're always working, always busy." I felt invisible, like I wasn't a priority anymore. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had worked hard, it's true, but I thought I was doing it for us, for our future. I thought we were on the same page. "So that's your excuse?" I said, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. "I wasn't around enough, so you decided to find someone else? To lie to me? To break us?" "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice cracking. "I wasn't looking for this. I didn't want this. But he was there, and he listened. He made me feel seen." I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "How long, Sarah?" I asked, my voice cold. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, I felt the knife twist. "A few months," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Months," I repeated, shaking my head in disbelief. "Months. So every late night, every secretive phone call, every excuse, you were with him?" She nodded, tears falling silently now. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. I paced the room, my thoughts racing. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Do I know him? Is he someone we know?" She hesitated again, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. You do, she said finally, her voice trembling. It's James. James. A friend. Someone I had trusted, someone who had been in our lives for years. The betrayal cut even deeper. I felt a surge of anger rise in me, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of sadness. James, I said, my voice breaking. How could you? I'm sorry, she said again, her voice pleading now. I never wanted to hurt you, Dan. I never wanted any of this to happen. But you let it happen, I said, my voice cold and distant. You made choices, Sarah. Choices that destroyed everything we built together. We sat in silence after that, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily between us. I wanted to scream, to cry, to make her understand the depth of my pain. But I didn't. I couldn't. I need time, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. I need time to figure out what to do next. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I understand, she said. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and got into my car. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't be there, not after everything that had just come to light. As I drove aimlessly through the city, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The life I thought I knew, the person I thought I knew, it was all a lie. I felt broken, lost, and completely alone. But even in the midst of that pain, one thought kept coming back to me: I needed answers. And I wasn't going to stop until I got them. The first few days after confronting Sarah were a blur. I stayed with a friend, crashing on his couch, trying to make sense of everything. The betrayal felt all-encompassing, like a shadow that followed me everywhere. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her words, and felt the weight of what she had done. I realized quickly that I couldn't carry this alone. The pain, the confusion, it was too much. I needed to talk to someone, to let it out before it consumed me. I called my best friend, Mike. We hadn't spoken in a while, not because of any falling out, but because life had just taken us in different directions. When he picked up, I didn't even know where to start. Hey, Mike, I said, my voice shaking. Dan. Hey, man. What's up? You sound off, he said, his voice immediately concerned. I need to talk, I said. It's about Sarah. Can I come over? Of course, he said without hesitation. Come by any time. When I got to his place, I sat down and tried to explain everything. At first, the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, and my chest felt heavy. But Mike just sat there, patient, waiting for me to find the courage to speak. She cheated, I said finally, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. With James. Mike's eyes widened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. Wow, he said. I don't even know what to say, man. That's a lot. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice breaking. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I keep replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where I went wrong. This isn't on you, Mike said firmly. You didn't do this. She did. Don't blame yourself for her choices. His words were comforting, but they didn't erase the pain. Still, just being able to talk to someone, to say the words out loud, felt like a small weight had been lifted. Over the next few days, I started opening up to more people. It wasn't easy, I felt ashamed, like somehow I had failed. But every time I shared my story, I felt a little less alone. I also knew I needed more than just the support of friends. The emotions I was dealing with, anger, sadness, confusion, were too overwhelming to handle on my own. So I decided to see a therapist. Walking into that office for the first time was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was admitting defeat. But the therapist, Dr. Carter, immediately made me feel at ease. Tell me what's on your mind, she said gently, her tone calm and reassuring. For the first time, I let everything out. The suspicions, the confrontation, the betrayal. I told her about Sarah's excuses, her confession, and the pain I couldn't seem to shake. I told her about James, about how his betrayal cut just as deep as Sarah's. Dr. Carter listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly and said, "What you're feeling is completely valid, Dan. Betrayal is one of the most painful experiences a person can go through. It shakes your sense of trust, not just in others, but in yourself." Her words hit me hard. She was right, I didn't just feel betrayed by Sarah. I felt like I couldn't even trust my own judgment anymore. How do I move past this? I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper. It's a process, she said. And it starts with letting yourself feel what you're feeling. Anger, sadness, confusion, they're all part of the healing process. But you also need to start focusing on yourself. What do you need, Dan? What do you want for your life moving forward? Her questions stayed with me long after that session. For so long, my life had revolved around Sarah, around our relationship, our plans, our future. But now, I had to start thinking about myself, something I hadn't done in years. I kept going to therapy, and each session helped me unpack a little more of the pain. Dr. Carter helped me understand that while Sarah's actions were hurtful, they didn't define me. I wasn't broken because of her choices. I wasn't less of a person because my marriage had fallen apart. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I had lost touch with over the years. It felt good to rebuild those relationships, to surround myself with people who cared about me and wanted to see me heal. One night, Mike invited me out for drinks with a few other friends. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't feel like myself, and the idea of being around people felt exhausting. But Mike insisted, and I'm glad he did. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. It wasn't forced or fake, it was real. For a few hours, I forgot about Sarah, about James, about everything. I felt like a person again, not just a broken shell of who I used to be. That night, as I drove home, I realized something important: I wasn't alone. I had people who cared about me, who wanted to see me happy. And as painful as the betrayal was, it didn't have to define the rest of my life. Healing wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time since everything had come crashing down, I felt like I could see a path forward. And that gave me hope. For so long, my identity had been tied to being Sarah's husband. Everything I did, every decision I made, was with her in mind. But now, for the first time in years, I had to ask myself, who am I? What do I want for my life? At first, those questions were terrifying. I didn't have answers. I wasn't even sure where to start. But I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay stuck in the pain forever. If I was going to move forward, I had to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. It started small. One morning, I went for a walk in the park near my apartment. The air was crisp, and the sound of birds chirping felt oddly comforting. I hadn't taken the time to just be present in years. I walked for hours that day, letting my mind wander, trying to reconnect with the world around me. That walk turned into a habit. Every morning, I'd lace up my shoes and head out, sometimes with music, sometimes in silence. It became a time for me to think, to breathe, and to start each day with a sense of clarity. I also started journaling. Dr. Carter had suggested it during one of our sessions, and at first, I was skeptical. Writing down my thoughts felt awkward, almost childish. But the more I did it, the more I realized how much I had been bottling up inside. Some days, my journal entries were angry, filled with the pain and betrayal I was still working through. Other days, they were hopeful, reflecting on small moments of joy or progress. Over time, those pages became a record of my healing, a way to see just how far I had come. I also started exploring old hobbies, things I had set aside over the years as life got busier. I picked up my guitar, dusting it off after years of neglect. The strings felt foreign under my fingers at first, but as I started strumming, muscle memory kicked in. Playing music again felt like reconnecting with an old friend, a part of myself I had almost forgotten. I began painting, too. I wasn't good at it, not by any stretch, but there was something therapeutic about putting brush to canvas, letting the colors blend and swirl. It didn't matter what the end result looked like, it was the process that mattered. Through these small acts of self-care, I started to feel more like myself again. I also took a long, hard look at my relationships, not just with Sarah, but with everyone in my life. I realized how many connections I had neglected over the years, how many people I had unintentionally pushed away. Rebuilding those relationships became a priority. I reconnected with my brother, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. We had drifted apart over the years, each caught up in our own lives, but sitting down with him over coffee reminded me of how much we had in common. We started meeting regularly, and those conversations became a source of comfort and support. I also joined a local running group. At first, I was hesitant, I wasn't much of a runner, and the idea of meeting new people felt daunting. But the group was welcoming, and I quickly realized how much I enjoyed the sense of camaraderie. Running became another outlet for my emotions, a way to channel my energy into something positive. One day, during one of our runs, a fellow member asked me why I had joined the group. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure how much to share. But then I told him the truth, about the betrayal, the heartbreak, and my journey to rediscover myself. To my surprise, he didn't pity me. Instead, he said, "Man, that takes courage. To go through all that and still show up here, trying to move forward. That's strength." His words stayed with me. For so long, I had seen myself as broken, as someone trying to piece his life back together. But in that moment, I realized that healing wasn't just about putting the pieces back, it was about building something new, something stronger. As the weeks turned into months, I started to notice small but significant changes in myself. I felt lighter, more confident. The pain was still there, but it didn't define me anymore. I was learning to live with it, to let it be a part of my story without letting it control me. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, I realized how far I had come. The man sitting there wasn't the same person who had walked out of that house on the night of the confrontation. He wasn't the same person who had spent sleepless nights questioning his worth, his choices, his future. I had grown. I had learned to prioritize myself, to find joy in the little things, to rebuild a sense of self-worth that had been missing for so long. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. Healing is never a straight line, and I knew there would be days when the pain would resurface, when the memories would still sting. But I also knew that I had the strength to face those moments, to keep moving forward. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about betrayal. It was a story about resilience, about finding light in the darkness, about discovering who I was when everything I thought I knew had been stripped away. And for the first time, I was excited to see what the next chapter of my life would hold. But before I could truly move forward, there was one decision I had to make, one that would determine the course of everything else. Do I try to rebuild my marriage, or do I let it go? It wasn't a decision I could make overnight. This wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal, it was about the life we had built together, the promises we had made, the love we had shared. Letting that go felt impossible. But trying to rebuild something that had been so deeply broken, that felt equally daunting. For days, I wrestled with the question. I made lists in my head, reasons to stay, reasons to leave. I replayed every conversation Sarah and I had ever had, every moment that had brought us joy, every argument that had left us frustrated. I thought about the vows we had exchanged on our wedding day. For better or for worse. Those words had meant everything to me. But what did they mean now? Was this something we could overcome? Or was it simply too much? One night, I sat across from Sarah at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, the air heavy with unspoken words. She looked at me, her eyes filled with regret, and said, "I know I've hurt you, Dan. More than I can ever say. And I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try. I want to fix this, if you'll let me." Her words hit me like a wave. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Was it possible to mend what had been broken? To rebuild the trust that had been shattered? But then I thought about everything we had been through, the lies, the betrayal, the pain. Could I really let that go? How? I asked her finally. How do we fix this? How do we go back to what we were? She hesitated, then said, "I don't know. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. I just don't want to lose you." Her words were sincere, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could go back to the way things were, that we could find our way back to each other. But deep down, I knew the truth. We couldn't go back. The trust we had built over years had been shattered in an instant. And while forgiveness was possible, forgetting was not. Every late night, every phone call, every excuse, it would all haunt me. And that wasn't a life I wanted to live. I spent the next few days searching for clarity. I talked to Mike, to Dr. Carter, to myself. I walked for hours, hoping that the answer would come to me. And eventually, it did. I realized that staying in the marriage would mean compromising my own well-being. It would mean living with doubt, with pain, with a constant fear that it could happen again. And as much as I still loved Sarah, I loved myself enough to know that I deserved better. So one evening, I sat down with her and told her my decision. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I've thought about this a lot. And as much as I wish things were different, I don't think we can fix this. Too much has happened, and I don't know if I can ever truly move past it." She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. "But we can try," she said, her voice breaking. "We can rebuild. People do it all the time." "I know," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But I don't think I can. I'll always care about you, Sarah. I'll always wish you the best. But I need to let go, for both of our sakes." The room was silent for a long time after that. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret, the guilt. And while part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay, I knew that wouldn't be fair, to her or to me. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we need to move on," I said. "I think it's the only way for us to find peace." The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Packing up the house we had shared, dividing our belongings, saying goodbye to the life we had built, it felt like tearing off a part of myself. But with each box I packed, with each step I took away from our shared life, I felt a little lighter. I didn't hate Sarah. In fact, part of me would always love her. But I knew that love wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done. And as much as it hurt to let her go, I knew it was the right decision. Ending the marriage wasn't the end of my journey, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where I could focus on myself, on my healing, on building a life that brought me joy and fulfillment. And while the road ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing for sure, I had made the right choice. Starting over was daunting. The life I had known, the plans I had made, were gone. Every corner of the house I once called home felt like it held a memory, some beautiful, others painful. I knew staying there would only anchor me to the past, so I made the decision to leave. Finding a new place wasn't easy. I spent weeks searching, touring apartments, trying to envision myself starting fresh. Most places felt impersonal, like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. But then, one afternoon, I stepped into a small, sunlit apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't perfect, the walls needed a fresh coat of paint, and the kitchen was smaller than I'd hoped, but something about it felt right. It felt like a blank canvas, waiting for me to make it my own. Moving day was bittersweet. Packing up my belongings was like sifting through the story of my life. I found old photos of Sarah and me from our early days, letters we had written to each other, souvenirs from trips we had taken. Each item brought a wave of emotion, nostalgia, sadness, even anger. There were moments when I had to stop, sit down, and let myself feel the weight of it all. Letting go of those things, of those memories, felt like letting go of a part of myself. But with each box I packed, with each decision to keep or discard, I felt a small sense of liberation. The first night in my new apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat on the floor with a pizza box and a beer, surrounded by unopened boxes. The space felt unfamiliar, almost foreign. But as I looked around, I reminded myself that this was the start of something new. This was my chance to create a life that was truly mine. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into making the apartment feel like home. I painted the walls, hung up art, and carefully arranged the furniture. It wasn't just about decorating, it was about reclaiming my sense of self. Each decision I made, each piece I chose, was a reflection of who I was now, not who I had been. I also began exploring the neighborhood. I found a small cafe down the street with the best coffee I'd ever had. The barista, a cheerful woman named Lisa, started to recognize me after a few visits. She'd ask how I was doing, and while I kept my answers short at first, I gradually opened up. Her kindness, though simple, reminded me that there was still good in the world, still people who cared. One evening, I attended a community event in the park, a small concert featuring local musicians. Sitting there under the stars, listening to the music, I felt a rare sense of peace. It wasn't that everything was perfect or that the pain had disappeared. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I also focused on building new routines. Mornings started with a run through the park, followed by journaling over a cup of coffee. Evenings were for reading, something I hadn't done in years. I rediscovered my love for fiction, losing myself in stories that reminded me of the resilience of the human spirit. Work became another anchor for me. I threw myself into projects, not as a distraction, but as a way to rebuild my confidence. My colleagues noticed the change in me, how I seemed more focused, more driven. One of them even commented, "You're like a different person these days, Dan. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." But moving forward wasn't just about creating new habits and finding new joys. It was also about confronting the parts of myself that I had neglected for so long. I had to face the questions I had been avoiding. What kind of life do I want to build? What kind of person do I want to be? Dr. Carter helped me navigate those questions. In one session, she asked me to write a letter to myself, not the me of today, but the me from a year ago, before everything fell apart. At first, I didn't know what to say. But as I started writing, the words flowed. "Dear Dan," I wrote. "I know you're hurting right now. I know you feel lost and betrayed. But I want you to know that this pain won't last forever. You're stronger than you think, and you'll find your way through this. Trust yourself. Believe in your ability to heal. And remember, this isn't the end, it's just the beginning of a new chapter." Reading those words back to myself was emotional, but it was also empowering. It reminded me of how far I had come, of the strength I had found within myself. As the months went on, I started to see glimpses of the life I was building, a life filled with purpose, joy, and authenticity. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when the memories crept in, when I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me. But those moments were becoming less frequent, less overwhelming. One day, as I was walking home from the cafe, I passed by a couple holding hands. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of what I had lost. But then I reminded myself that love wasn't gone from my life, it was just taking a different form. I was learning to love myself, to appreciate the person I was becoming. And in doing so, I was opening myself up to the possibility of love in the future, not out of need, but out of choice. Starting over had been one of the hardest things I had ever done. But it was also one of the most rewarding. I was no longer defined by my past, by the pain, or by the betrayal. I was defined by the choices I was making now, by the life I was creating for myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. Freedom, I realized, wasn't just about leaving the pain behind. It was about embracing who I had become because of it. It was about taking the broken pieces of my life and shaping them into something stronger, something more meaningful. And as I began to heal, I felt a growing desire to share what I had learned, to use my experience to help others who might be struggling in the same way. It started small. One evening, I came across an online forum where people were sharing their stories of heartbreak and betrayal. I read post after post, each one echoing the emotions I had felt: anger, sadness, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. I hesitated before writing my own post. Part of me wondered if anyone would care, if my story would make a difference. But as I began typing, the words came easily. I shared what had happened, how I had struggled, and how I had found a way to move forward. The response was overwhelming. People thanked me for my honesty, for showing them that healing was possible. Some shared their own stories, while others simply said, "This gives me hope." Encouraged by their responses, I began to seek out other ways to connect with people. I joined a local support group for individuals recovering from divorce and infidelity. Walking into that room for the first time, I wasn't sure what to expect. But as I sat down and listened to others share their stories, I felt an immediate sense of belonging. When it was my turn to speak, I told them about my journey, the doubts, the heartbreak, the moments of self-discovery. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told them about the nights I cried myself to sleep, the mornings I struggled to get out of bed, and the small victories that gave me the strength to keep going. After the meeting, a woman approached me. "Thank you for sharing," she said. "I've been feeling so alone, but hearing your story made me realize I'm not the only one going through this." Her words stayed with me. They reminded me of the power of vulnerability, of how sharing our pain can help others feel less isolated. I began attending the group regularly, not just to share my own experiences but to listen to others. I realized that healing wasn't just about focusing on myself, it was about building connections, about being there for others in their moments of need. Over time, I started leading some of the group sessions. It wasn't something I had planned, but people began turning to me for advice and support. I found that I had a natural ability to empathize, to help others see the light at the end of the tunnel. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, a man in the group said to me, "You've got a gift, Dan. You've been through hell, but you didn't let it break you. And now you're helping the rest of us find our way. That's something special." His words struck a chord with me. For so long, I had seen my experience as a source of pain. But now, I was beginning to see it as a source of strength, a way to make a difference in the lives of others. I also started volunteering at a local nonprofit that provided counseling and resources for individuals going through difficult transitions. Whether it was a divorce, the loss of a loved one, or a major life change, the people who walked through those doors were searching for hope. And I wanted to be part of giving them that hope. One of the most rewarding moments came when a young man approached me after a workshop I had helped facilitate. He told me about his own struggles with infidelity and how he had been on the verge of giving up. "Hearing your story made me realize that I can get through this," he said. "Thank you for showing me that there's life after this kind of pain." Those words reinforced something I had come to believe: our greatest struggles can become our greatest sources of strength, not just for ourselves but for others. Through this ordeal, I learned the importance of self-love and resilience. I learned that it's okay to ask for help, to lean on others when the weight of the world feels too heavy. And I learned that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about growing. I also discovered that my story wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone who had ever faced betrayal, heartbreak, or loss. By sharing it, I was helping others see that they weren't alone, that there was a way forward, even when the path seemed unclear. Looking back now, I don't regret what happened. As painful as it was, it shaped me into the person I am today, a person who is stronger, more compassionate, and more connected to the people around him. Life doesn't always go the way we plan. Sometimes, it throws us challenges we never expected, challenges that threaten to break us. But in those moments, we have a choice, to let the pain define us or to use it as a catalyst for growth. I chose growth. And today, as I stand here sharing my story, I know that I made the right choice. Not just for me, but for everyone who needs to hear it. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: no matter how dark things may seem, there is always a way forward. And sometimes, the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. For me, that destination wasn't a physical place, it was a state of mind. It was a sense of peace, of knowing that I had taken control of my life and reclaimed my sense of self. It was the realization that even after the darkest days, there's a light waiting for you if you're willing to take the steps toward it. But my journey doesn't end here. Healing isn't a one-time event, it's an ongoing process, a commitment to choosing growth and self-love every single day. And while the pain of betrayal will always be a part of my story, it no longer defines me. What defines me now is the strength I found within myself, the connections I've built with others, and the purpose I've discovered in helping people who are walking their own paths of healing. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this: you are not alone. Whatever you're going through, whatever challenges you're facing, there is a way forward. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but you have the strength within you to overcome it. I know this because I've lived it. I've felt the weight of heartbreak, the fear of uncertainty, the struggle to rebuild. And I've come out the other side stronger, more compassionate, and more determined to live a life that is true to who I am. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. Sharing my story has been one of the most vulnerable things I've ever done, but it's also been one of the most rewarding. Knowing that my experience might help even one person find hope, find strength, or take that first step toward healing makes it all worth it. If my story resonated with you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Wild Love Story. Your support means the world to me, and it helps us continue to share real-life stories of resilience, hope, and growth. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Each one is a reminder that no matter what life throws at us, we all have the power to rise above it. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Together, we can remind the world that even in the face of heartbreak, there is always hope, always healing, and always a way forward.